Welcome to the Matthews Mentality Podcast. In this episode, we're excited to have Danny Gold, an award-winning journalist and documentarian. Danny is known for his exceptional work in investigative journalism and as a war correspondent with his insightful commentary on global issues, including conflict reporting in Syria, Gaza, Iraq, El Salvador, and more. Danny has made a name for himself by uncovering critical stories and providing in-depth analysis on some of the most pressing topics of our time. His work has earned him numerous accolades, including a 2018 Pulitzer grantee for investigative reporting in El Salvador and several national headliner awards. This episode was recorded last week in New York City. However, I wanted to lead in with a fantastic 3-minute video overviewing some of Danny's best work. I'm excited for you guys to listen.
We heard a few booms. I saw one of the incoming shells come in. Apparently it hit the back area of the hotel. There's something right there. Look.
Watch it.
They just hit the hotel. Things are starting to get a lot more hectic right now. We're not sure what that is. We think it's an airstrike. There's planes overhead pretty much every 5 minutes right now. If he gets animated right now and comes back to life, who is Ronald Reagan voting for? 2 men have been shot. We were trying to figure out how to get them to the hospital, but we were surrounded.
Turn your vehicles around and leave the city of Ferguson immediately.
I'm personally gonna be out here protesting. I'm not planning to kick in nobody's door. I'm not planning to steal anything. But I'm planning to let my voice be heard that the fact that what happened out there, outside my door, right here out this window, was wrong.
If you look out, there's just these camps and nothing anywhere else. Has a very end of the earth type feel.
This is the 12 gauge, and this holds 6 shells, and they'll move a chair across this floor with you in it.
You know, this is what it is here. It's chaos. And what's it like for you when you're off your meds?
It's horrible. But that right now ain't my main concern. My main concern is where I'm gonna live.
Is there fear here of Muslims?
Things have gotten pretty bad over here, and unfortunately a lot of local businesses have been destroyed.
Dernier message Timbiti Mouni, opinion internationale. Et puis moi là en témoin que a famille angati lango nandoti piste et il venu que souffrir na chingunda. Il mou 48 heures. Tongana lo démissionner pe i ke sigi et pas la duty responsable.
So this right here is why Donald Trump has such a high support base in the upstate region of South Carolina.
Podemos ocasionar es que acabar con el país.
There's just a complete shortage of medical professionals, of healthcare facilities, of space to treat this disease. But we're about as close to the border as you can get.
Because they sit here, because they believe it's theirs. They're all involved.
And for you, that's guilty enough, just being here. Saw 2 suspects. They're being chased right now. They're running out. Tarkos, the village we were just in, came under attack. Everyone is fleeing. We're told upwards of 10,000 Christians are fleeing the area right now. We're trying to drive out of here, but there was more gunfire. We had to leave. And now we're hiding and waiting. It's tense, and this is what these people go through every night. It's terrifying. Right at the scene of a shooting that just happened, we heard over the speaker that the guy was shot 6 times. But the gangs sort of have to take some responsibility for that. You know, they're the ones also making this country bleed right now.
Claro que tenemos que tomar responsabilidad.
Danny, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So hold on. All right. So you're a journalist, and I was in preparation for this. I was like, okay, Syria, Gaza, Liberia, El Salvador. Like, how do you get these assignments? Is this something you raise your hand for, or are you like, hey, you're the new guy, you're the low man on the totem pole, you got to go do this? Like, how does that happen?
It's a mix of most of those things. I mean, I started off doing this on my own, like self-funding and buying like one-way plane tickets and having to put things together and then pitching them out because it's the kind of work I wanted to do. Once I started working for a company, I worked for Vice for a couple of years. A lot of the times it was stuff that I pitched myself I wanted to go do. When it came to Ebola in Liberia, they were like, okay, who's willing to do this? I volunteered. It was one of those situations where the question came up and I didn't have time to think about what I was volunteering for. And my hand just kind of went up. My mouth started moving, saying words.
And you're saying things you didn't totally believe. Like, I want to go.
Yeah. I was like, yeah, sure. Why not? I think I was frustrated at the time with being in New York for too long. Probably should have thought about that a little bit longer. But one of the things about, doing this job is that you've got to get really good or be born with the ability to not think of the potential consequences of your actions, which can be beneficial in this career, probably not in other aspects of life.
Well, so it helps being young. That there's like a correlation in not thinking about the consequences of your actions and being younger, right?
Young and stupid.
Yeah.
Both those things are helpful.
That's true. So is this something that you always, like, even as a kid, you say, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be a journalist who goes into these conflict zones or these, with Ebola, like these places in the country that, or in the world that are, there's just a lot going on? Or is that something that happened later on in life?
No, it kind of happened much later on in life. I wasn't one of those people who knew what they wanted to do at like 10 or 15 or even 22. I just kind of, I was a smart kid, but not a disciplined kid. Went with it. Around 22, 23, I started traveling a bit. My uncle actually leads these expeditions. He has a kind of adventure travel company, and he does this trip. It's all by bicycle. And he started this in his 50s. He's a fascinating guy. And he had this trip that went from Cairo to Cape Town, 4 months on a bicycle.
Yeah, it's like the entire continent of Africa.
Yeah. It's called the Tour d'Afrique. That's the name of the company. And they do it all over the world now. But I went on that trip when I was 23. And it was a very eye-opening experience. I did a lot of reading of books about East Africa during that time in terms of situations where there was conflict, a lot of reporter sort of books, and the way they talked about being in these places where things were happening, where history was being made. It struck me as a kind of life that I wanted to lead. Originally, I was thinking about like travel reporter, travel writer. That's even a less feasible job than being a war journalist. So after 22, 23, 24, I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. How do I go about doing it?
And were you, like, as a kid, it's hard to, be accurate in self-assessment, but as a kid, to your best of your recollection, were you, I guess simply put, were you like a really brave kid who was always daring and taking chances, or is this?
No, I mean, in certain things, I think I can be brave and take chances, and I'm not risk averse. Other things like I remember like I'd go to countries that were in the middle of a war and I'd cover that, and I'd come home and I'd have to go to like IKEA to pick out curtains for my apartment, and I'd be like not melting down, but having like a panic attack to a degree. So there's sort of a I don't know, it's almost like a contradiction in some ways. Like I'm terrified of roller coasters. Like I will not get on a roller coaster. I've gone skydiving.
But you'll go hang with some MS-13 members in El Salvador, no problem.
It's just kind of, it's different in that regard. So, brave in some ways, definitely not brave in other ways.
Now, we're here in New York City. I know the answer to this question, but where are you from?
I grew up in White Plains, so the suburbs of New York.
Yeah, that's where my wife's from, good place.
Westchester, man. It's
that's right.
lot going on there, more than people think. It was a good place to grow up, especially White Plains. Like it kind of taught me how to interact with people from every place in the world, every background, and I've taken that into my work.
You'll know much better than I ever could, but having, obviously through my wife, spent a lot of time up there. I always say it's kind of a cheat code where you get that suburb feel, that kind of like white picket fence vibe, but then you're, there is more going on out there than a lot of people think, but then you're one Metro North ride into the biggest city in the country, and, there's so much available at your fingertips. Were you exposed to journalism, kind of being here? Or is that something that?
That's a good question. I always read the newspaper when I was a kid. Like started off obviously just reading like the comics and the sports page, but ended up doing a lot more of that, reading the whole thing. And my parents were very, geopolitically aware. And
What did they do?
My dad was an engineer consultant type guy. He had a couple of different jobs for a while. My mom was a corporate lawyer, but neither of them were born in the States. And they were both sort of like politically aware, very tuned into what was going on in the world.
So you would like talk about it at the dinner table.
Yeah. And they were also like not the type of people who like dumb things down for their kids.
They
like
just hit you with it.
Yeah. I mean, my dad grew up in a communist country till he was like 16 in Czechoslovakia.
Oh yeah.
And you know, when you're 17 or 16 and you learn about communism and you're like, oh, this is a great idea.
Yeah.
And like you tell your parents that at the dinner table, my dad's like, all right, let me tell you what it's like
The
to
real
actually.
deal.
Yeah. So I got educated very young in
You realize the premise of communism, to your point, great idea until it runs into human nature.
right. Or someone who's actually lived under it.
Yeah.
So there were conversations like that. And you know, I think I was encouraged to learn more about the world, not from just like, oh, you should know this stuff, but because I like to win arguments and I didn't want to lose them. So I had to know what I was talking about.
Our COO, Rady Zlatkov, grew up in a communist country. And so as, you know, some parts of our country right now maybe are thinking that might be a good program. He's like, well, let me tell you how it really works. And some of what he shares, again, he had a nice childhood growing up and he immigrated to the US in his teens, but like, he was just like, it doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I'm sure your parents or your dad having grown up in a communist country, it gives you a different perspective.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so, high school, White Plains High School, and then where'd you go to college?
I went to college at Tufts University, so right
Yeah,
outside
sure.
Boston.
Of course. And you majored in journalism?
I majored in political science.
Okay.
Mostly, you know, there were a couple of classes I was interested in that I focused, but mostly just kind of coasted. I think I was immature at the time and didn't realize the opportunities that I had in front of me, wasted them. Spent a lot of time, you know, getting high and watching the same movies over and over.
Yeah.
Which
Well, for a lot of people, that's also called college.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So that was a way, you know, this interesting thing. And then I think around my junior year, I decided I wanted to write. And I had this realization in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. I'm not going to go too much more into that story.
I'm about to say, you probably were high as shit.
Yeah. You can make assumptions based on what was going on.
Yeah.
I think I was leaning towards that.
The
you know,
mushrooms were hitting hard.
that's actually, all right. You said it, not me. So I'm going to leave it at that. But
that's funny.
yeah, I mean, I was always interested. I was a big reader.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I took a Hemingway class in Spain at the time when I was doing that. And something about like seeing these paintings, I was just like, I want to go around the world. I want to know how other people live. I want to know what they're going through. You know, that wasn't the complete genesis, I think, of why I went into journalism and writing in the first place, but that was definitely an element to it.
And what were your parents' thoughts when you know, kind of came home and said, hey, I think I want to be a journalist?
Oh, they were not happy. You know, my parents are immigrants.
Yeah.
And when you're an immigrant, you don't want your kids going into anything that's not like being a doctor or a lawyer or
A
an engineer.
safe, secure, reliable, and
Right.
consistent income. Yeah.
Right. And
sure.
they're like, we worked very hard in life because we had no opportunities. We had to make our own. And then to just go into like, I mean, at least it wasn't, you know, the arts completely.
Yeah.
But they were, you know, they were supportive, I guess, in their own way. But it was definitely for years, even when I was started doing really well, they were kind of like, you know, you could still be a lawyer. You can still go to law school. So
Yeah, they just I mean, you said it perfectly. As immigrants, is my understanding is like they've come from such uncertainty that all they want for their kids is certainty, and the certainty I'm referring to is like certainty of a paycheck, certainty of a house, certainty of food. That oftentimes in the countries, to your point earlier, that they came from, they didn't have that certainty. And journalism, again, it's not like you're not an artist, right? Painting paintings, which I say was probably maybe the most uncertain of industries, but it doesn't have that. So I could see how like they were like, oh, okay. And so how did it start? Like you had this moment, you said, I think I want to write, and I'm kind of framing it as journalism. Like what was the first thing you did? Like what was the first step you took?
yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I didn't really know how to go about becoming this thing or doing it.
Yeah, like, what do you do? You start a blog? Like what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know, you know, I didn't have any connections in the industry. Neither did my parents. You know, I was too late to sort of go to school for it. I didn't even know that you could go to school for it like at first when I was 19, 20. I wasn't paying attention to these things. I got out of school and I was going to go on this expedition my uncle was doing. I was doing a little bit of work for him, and I was like, all right, I'm going to write a blog while I'm there, and I'll turn that into a book. Wrote a blog, people liked it, didn't really know how to turn anything into a book. So was kind of right back to the drawing board. It took me a couple years. I did a lot of working crummy jobs to save money and go places and do things. I tried to make a documentary when I was like, I took a month-long class in learning how to work a camera, which I had no idea about. And this was, the VHS days.
Yeah.
So, it was like one of the mini things.
Sure.
And I had an idea for a documentary in Israel, actually, about African refugees there. And I went there and I spent about 3 months living on family and friends' couches. And I made this documentary. I had no idea what I was doing, just knew how to turn on a camera and point it in the right direction. And I loved it. It was just like everything I wanted to do. I felt like I was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to be doing.
And you had the common word is passion. I like enthusiasm, but you found to have natural organic enthusiasm for what you do. It didn't feel like work.
Yeah, no, yeah. I loved every second of it. And I think a lot of people talk about doing this sort of stuff. Everyone wants to make documentaries. Everyone wants to make a podcast.
Yep.
But very few people actually go do it. And that's what I always tell young people when they ask me how to do this. Mostly I warn them from going into journalism in the first place. But if they're insistent, I'm like, you have to actually just start doing it, because no one's going to hand it to you. No one's going to show you how to do it, really. Even if you get a mentor or someone to respond to you over emails, you still have to go somewhere and turn a camera on.
You have to do it. And it's kind of like podcasts, and then you have to do it over and over consistently, like a volume game. Right. It has to be good content, but a volume game over a long period of time. It isn't I feel like it's one of those professions where you're like, oh, I just need that one video to hit it big. And you're like, yeah, you certainly could have one great one, but it's just consistently stacking good product, good work upon good work. And over time, you'll wake up one day 10, 15, 20 years in and actually be a name in the industry. Is that your experience?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a slog, podcasting, especially the one I'm working on right now, I started 4 years ago during the pandemic.
Is it Underground? Yeah.
Underworld podcast. And it takes time. I had a name in journalism at that point. I had somewhat of an audience, but it's not a thing where you're just rocketing to the moon. Even if your idea is great, you have to build it and keep doing it. I think podcasting, more so than documentaries, a lot of people start it.
Yeah.
Very few people make it to the 6-month mark because they just give up, or it gets too tiring, or they can't stick with it. And I've had people come to me for both those things. I want to start a podcast. I want to do documentaries. Yeah. And once I kind of show them how much work is involved in it and how little money, especially in the beginning, most people either throw in the towel or start it up for a couple weeks and then give up.
Do you think that's because most people, and again, I'm using kind of a buzzword here, it's because they're really just looking for not a get rich quick, get successful quick, kind of a viral moment. And if in the first 6 months, oh, my podcast hasn't gone viral, or I haven't, again, this isn't necessarily a vernacular used for this, but I haven't gone viral as a journalist, this is too hard, I'm going to give up. I feel like a lot of people get into it saying okay, well, if I can experience tremendous success very quickly, that's going to be great. And then 6 months in, as you know, in your profession, in real estate, very different, but same in my profession, there's no viral in 6 months. They're just this is too hard, I don't want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of it. There's no clear-cut path, I think, with a lot of these things. You have to create your own path, and you have to get used to rejection, a lot of rejection. People are going to turn every story you pitch down for years. Even now, even when I had a name, I'd email people that I felt maybe their publication should be lucky to have me in it.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't respond to the email. And that's just something you have to get used to, especially when you're starting off.
We were talking just outside in the green room. You're in sales, right? We're all in sales.
Yeah. No, it really is. And it took me a little bit longer than I would have liked to realize that. You've got to sell the story that you want to do to either your boss or a random editor. And then you've got to sell yourself basically to the people that you want to follow or interview or talk to. And then you've got to sell that story to your audience. So it is sales. You're selling yourself a lot. It's all sales.
It's
sales
multi-layered
is a big
selling.
Part of it.
I'll get back to that, but you said something earlier. You're kind of talking about your path. I want to actually stay on that in a sense. So you graduate from Tufts, poli-sci, but you're like, hey, I think I want to be a journalist. And it sounds like you almost kind of had a sense of what type of journalist, right? Not necessarily at first travel and leisure, but maybe, I don't know if you call it war correspondent or something to that effect, like conflict journalist. It sounds like you were starting to do some of those things. How long were you, I guess, call it freelancing or just kind of learning on the fly before you said, let me go get formally educated on this?
Yeah. So I made that documentary. It's like a 15-minute thing. And I had it done. I thought it was good, but it clearly wasn't good enough. And I had no idea what to do with it. Like, I didn't know how to pitch. I didn't have anyone working in any publication or back then,
distribution, like how do you get it out there?
And back then, digital media, there were a lot more places. I mean, we're talking like 2007, 2008. There were a lot of places like that. And I'd reached out to a couple of people, but nothing made sense to me. I just didn't know how to. Some people know this. They don't need to go to school for it. I had no idea how to maneuver. So I used that like 15-minute doc to apply to grad school to a bunch of them. And I ended up going to the City University of New York because they gave me money to go there. So it was.
And to major in journalism.
The grad school. So it was the journalism program.
Got it. Okay.
So, you could go to Columbia and pay $80,000 a year. You could go to NYU and pay $40,000 a semester for a year and a half. And I got into all those schools. CUNY was like, hey, we'll give you your first year for free, and then it's $3,500 a semester. So I jumped at that. I went to that, and I learned a lot there. Like, I really learned how to pitch, how to tell stories, and a really important thing is you make connections in the industry.
Sure.
So I had friends who were in school with me or professors or whatever else who could give you guidance that I didn't have, and I didn't appreciate before that how important like a mentor is. I didn't even know how to find one.
Yeah, a mentor and to your point, a network. Right?
Yes, a network is huge.
So mentorship, network, what you get your master's, you get educated in journalism. What was the first assignment out of school?
The first job I had out of school was working at a friend's sandwich shop.
Oh, okay.
Because I was freelancing on the side.
Yeah.
So I was freelancing on the side. I wrote a couple of articles. I was big into boxing then. And I was at a gym in New York. And if you know boxing or martial arts, I think you do BJJ, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every gym is full of people with stories.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of boxers there. One of them was Egyptian. And this was during the Arab Spring had kicked off. And he was banned from going back home before that. I don't remember exactly why. So I did an article on him for like the New York Times local section. And then there was another boxer there who had done 5 years in prison for, he had, was like a prodigy, was supposed to be this great fighter, ended up getting locked up on a cocaine charge, had to do a couple of years, and he was making his comeback. And I did those two things for the New York Times, like local section. I think there were also a couple small publications I did stuff for. And because of a friend I had in journalism school, I started becoming what's known as like a street reporter or a runner for the New York Post. And what that is it's kind of the best job in the world. I mean, the pay is not anything you could live off of, but basically for the newspapers, the local New York papers, the New York Post, the Daily News, which are big papers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal had a New York section then. There's these reporters who you're not really in the office, but you get a phone call that morning or the night before telling you, we need coverage of this event, this press conference, this opening, whatever it is. Most of the time it's crime scenes. So you get a call being like, someone got killed in this neighborhood last night. We need you to go there, knock on doors, try to find witnesses, see what happened. Or, it could happen that day, and you're basically running around.
It's pretty exciting work, right?
Oh, it's incredible. You feel like you're in an episode of Law and Order every single time. You're standing there smoking cigarettes with your friends because you become friends with all the other
Let me pause you.
reporters.
As this runner, and I'm just taking your lead, a good chunk of it being crime scenes. What's the kind of craziest thing that ever happened to you as you were looking for details?
That is a great question. I'm trying to think of anything specific. I did the Boston bombing story while this was happening.
Oh.
I did Sandy Hook, the Connecticut shooting. So that was probably
That was
pretty
terrible.
dark. Hurricane Sandy stuff. A lot of running around. You're knocking on doors of people who don't want to talk to you. Some of them, like I remember knocking on doors and people were obviously, like a couple that were obviously in the midst of like smoking crack. And you've got to kind of ask them questions that they don't want to answer, and they're kind of tweaking, and you're there.
Yeah.
A lot of the times you're with a photographer. So
Which
you kind of have
makes people Oh,
well, it made me more comfortable. It made me more comfortable.
I see what you say. Yeah, you certainly, you got some muscle with you.
Yeah,
but then they're also like, why are you taking photos?
Right.
You need to be a commercial real estate broker because when you're selling a building in multifamily and you have to serve notices, like you serve a notice, you put them on each door in an apartment building, that the next day you're going to be coming through with inspectors because the buyer needs to inspect each unit for deferred maintenance, things like that. You never know what's behind the door.
Yeah.
And you enter into people's homes and not in a traditional home sense. I mean, like it could be some pretty tough buildings and multiple times you open a door and like even though you posted a notice, they didn't come out, they didn't see it, they don't care. And you're banging on this door trying to get in because you got to get in to see the units and gone like right in your face multiple times.
Yeah,
like,
man.
There's some reporting.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, you have.
But I was saying, like, if you're asking around for a crime scene, especially in certain neighborhoods, they don't want to talk to you. Like, how would you get them to engage? Like, again, we were talking sales. How do you sell them on why they should talk to you and tell you something that maybe they heard or saw?
Yeah, I mean, you have two experiences, right? Sometimes you're talking to someone on the worst day of their life and they've lost a loved one. Sometimes you're talking to the loved one of someone who was just arrested for doing that thing.
Yeah,
and it's tough. I mostly, it's like a first date. You kind of have to BS with people, make them feel comfortable. There's ways of doing it. I think reporters can be really patronizing when they approach people. And I think that comes across as disingenuous, being like, you should really talk to us. Don't you want their story to be out there? We can make a difference. I refuse to do that. But most of the time, if you're just kind of not unrelenting, but you can convince some people. Consistent. You can convince some people. There's definitely people who are never going to talk to you. A lot of the times people actually do want to talk to media. They just don't want to admit that, or they don't want you to realize that. So they'll be standoffish in that regard. But it's a lot of like first impressions. You only have a couple seconds to get that across.
What was your first big break in your journalism career? Like where you're like, whoa, I got this assignment, or I got hired for this.
Got hired for it. So the first foreign reporting trip I ever did, I went to, and I had been working for the New York Post at that point. So I had done some big stories on a local paper, but that's all stuff that like, I'm getting a phone call to go somewhere and do it. So it doesn't really feel like something that's a big break. I went to Iraq in 2012. I had a friend that was Kurdish Iraqi. He was based here. He had some contacts there. I wanted to get my start in doing war journalism, conflict journalism. And that was an area that was relatively safe at that point.
Yeah.
But still, somewhere that could get dicey and that people were interested in. And, I bought a one-way ticket and went by myself.
What part of Iraq?
So the northern Iraq, like
I'm trying to place like geography and time to ISIS, because didn't they kind of come out of northern Iraq?
They did come
like
out of
2014, 15.
Yeah.
So this is right before that.
This is right before when no one cared that much.
See,
about northern Iraq.
Still got that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I went back and did that in 2014 and 2016. But they came from right across the border of like what they call Kurdistan, the Kurdish area of northern Iraq. So Mosul's where they came from. But at that point, it was still kind of like an area that people weren't covering that much.
So you had a friend who was Kurdish Iraqi, which is kind of northern Iraq, and you said, "Hey, this is kind of what I think I want to focus my journalism on." You just get on a plane and you just start walking around with a camera and a microphone. What happens?
Yeah, I was just writing then, so no camera. Although I had like a regular like DSLR, right?
And sorry, and was there any? Gosh, let me think of how I want to phrase this. Was there any prompting by a company to do this, or you said, I'm just going to do it and hopefully someone likes my product?
That's a great question. There was none. There was no, I had this realization that I wanted to do this work and no one was going to send me to do it. And no one was going to give me permission to do it. So I had to do it myself, but it wasn't like a sort of haphazard, willy-nilly thing. I took months to do research. My friend was very well connected there. He was a reporter himself, but he was based in New York now. So, we'd have weekly or every 2 weeks we'd meet and discuss things, what stories could be. I was reading every report I could get. I was reading academic papers, trying to build stuff out. And he would connect me to certain people. I did all the research I can. I spoke to people who had been there. I still got there and, everything falls apart right away. I had no idea what I was doing. And it was frustrating. I eventually ended up going into northeast Syria on that trip with a photographer I had linked up with online who had a little bit more experience than I did. And that was when Syria had been in the midst of a civil war, but the northeast area.
Yeah, because 2012 when was it al-Assad gassed his people or something?
2013. 2013, yeah. But similar situation. So Syria was in the midst of this civil war, and there was this small story that people weren't talking about, which was that in the northeast, the Kurds had sort of taken over their area. And it was a relatively tranquil area compared to what else was going on at that time. And I linked up with this photographer, and we had this opportunity to go into Syria at that time and sort of, cover this thing that not a lot of people were covering. And that ended up being like the first really big story. And for the entire time I was in Iraq, I was there for a month, in Syria for a week, and I couldn't sell the story. I was like failing miserably. I was extremely frustrated. I was spending money, like spending everything and not making anything back. We went into Syria for this week. Again, felt like I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. I came back with these stories and I still couldn't sell them. I was home in New York trying to pitch them out, writing them, couldn't get anything going. Finally, a friend I had at journalism school was doing some like part-time work for NBC. He hooked me up with an editor there for NBC.com, the website. And that was like the first big story in my mind that I had ever done. And again, same thing, network that helped it out, taking a chance. But, there were definitely times when I felt like I was failing while I was
Well, that's what I was
doing
going to ask, like in those moments of failure, what within, from a mindset perspective, like what kept you from, because I was going to say, I'm sure a lot of people have done what you did, like where they start this career, but I don't think a lot of people took a one-way trip to Iraq. But, let's make an assumption. A lot of people start things and it's going and it's really tough and it doesn't work out well. And they go, well, this isn't for me. Let me go find something else to do. What was it in your opinion that kind of said, I'm going to keep hustling. I'm going to keep selling. I'm going to keep making these until it works.
I just felt like I didn't have a choice. Like this is what I wanted to do. And I was struggling and I was mad at myself sometimes and frustrated, but like I knew what I had was good. I knew that what I was doing was good. You also like don't want to look like a fool. If there's something that I really want to do, I start telling people because I know that
this
like,
is a hack.
Once I put it out there, like I'm not the kind of person that wants to talk about something and not be about it.
Yes, this is
so
true.
When I'm nervous about something, when I'm getting a little scared and feeling a little like I might disappoint myself, I start telling people that like I'm going to do this thing. And then like you got to follow through.
It's a great practice we tell our teammates at the company is like, you set your business. We don't use the word goal. We use commitments, business commitments for the year, and then share them with the person who sits next to you, share them with your boyfriend or girlfriend, your husband and wife, share them with your parents, with your kids, with your best friend. Like say, this is what I'm going to do this year. Because that is in many ways the greatest motivation, because you don't want to let those people, you don't want them to think less of you. You don't want to be like, oh, so you don't follow through on your commitments, huh?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I love that style. I love that strategy of like, okay, if I'm going to do something big, I'm not just going to think about it, I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell everybody I'm going to do it, because then I kind of have to do it.
You got to follow through.
Speaking of podcasts, I was just listening. What was it? It was Rogan and Adam Sandler, and he had Adam Sandler.
Oh yeah, I heard that one.
And Adam Sandler was like, he was kind of talking about how he made it in Hollywood. He was like, well, he's like, I can't do the Adam Sandler voice. Like, kind of like, I think the reason I just kept going is because I told everyone in high school, I'm going to go to Hollywood and I'm going to make it big. And, I didn't want them to think I was like kind of a loser. So he's like, I remember after some stand-up comedies out in LA, he's like, I ate it, which is like a slang for it bombed. And he's like, I ate it, but I call him like, yeah, it's going great out here. Like everybody says I'm doing great. And so, yeah, I feel you on that. If you share what you say you're going to do with people you care about, people's opinion you care about, it increases the probability you get it done.
Yeah. And the other thing too is that I forget exactly what the line is, but have you ever seen Bronx Tale?
Yeah.
When I think De Niro is talking to his kid in that, and he's like, the saddest thing in life is wasted potential or wasted opportunity. I'm not sure which one. I mean, that's kind of how I feel about myself sometimes. Like I don't want to waste the opportunities that I have. And when I look back on my family, the previous generations, like very few of that, no one had the opportunities that I have. So like I have to take advantage of this. I have to make something happen.
It sounds like you think that. So I think all 4 of your grandparents were Holocaust survivors.
Yeah.
And I don't want to lead you here, but it sounds like that's a big driver. And like, look, they went through some some really bad stuff to put me in a position to pursue, your passion, so to speak. Like I have to go all the way.
Yeah. I mean, there's guilt there too, right?
Yeah.
It's
No,
kind of
no,
like
I
they
get it.
lived through everything that stuff that no one should have to.
And so if your first, journalism trip doesn't work out well, it's like, I'm not going to quit. Like they didn't quit. Right.
No. And it's like, being born into the opportunities that I had and the life that I had to accomplish like what they accomplished, that sort of proportionality. Like I'd have to, I don't know, cure cancer or be an astronaut. And I'm not doing that, but I'm trying to do something, so that was
something meaningful. Yeah.
Right. That was a big part of it. Like I it sounds hyperbolic to say it, but like my existence is kind of a miracle. These are two Polish Jews, Western Poland. So like when it got split up, like that's the part the Nazis took, not the Soviet Union. And my other two grandparents are two Slovakian Jews. And when you look at the odds of people surviving, of those types of people surviving the 1940s in Slovakia and in Poland, very small.
Yeah.
So for them, like I gotta do, like I owe it to them. It's like a miracle that like my family is able to exist. So
I could feel just talking to you, like the big driver for you, right? Big motivation. And it put you in a position where it sounds like through, good product, but also your network, your first, how does it work? Is it a video? Is it an article? Is it a contract or is it employee? Like where you get, was it NBC? You said?
So I just did one or two articles for them, but it starts building up, right? So I went back to work.
Well, hold on. Let me push time out. Like the first time you write this article and it's on NBC.
Yeah.
Like, what's that feeling like where you see your name,
I mean, it's great, especially because it was like, I had seen my name in the papers before, right? And that's an amazing feeling.
Sure.
Print, whatever else. This was my first time seeing my name.
Your parents like keep clippings of it?
Yeah, I think they did in the beginning.
Yeah. All right.
It's my first time seeing my name on like a piece of news from a foreign reporting thing on like, NBCnews.com was the big website at that time. It feels great. You're sharing it on all your socials. I don't know even what was around back 2012, but
you had MySpace.
Yeah. And it's an amazing feeling, and you want that feeling again. But it doesn't lead to an automatic job or like making a ton of money, right? I think I got paid like $1,000 for that article with photos, which is more than a bunch of other ones that I got paid for similar situations. But what happens is, I was able to come back to work. I think I was working for the Wall Street Journal then. I was permalance, so I didn't really have a contract. I just did stuff for them on a day-to-day basis. But I had this to build off of. So the next time I went somewhere, which was approximately 5 or 6 months later, that time I went to Turkey and I went to Syria. I had a bunch of stuff that I'd sold already. I had a bunch of editors' contacts. So I had stuff kind of sold before I got there this time. So the first time I lost money by far. Second time I broke even.
When you say have things to sell, and maybe it's both, is the content is like, hey, I'm going to go to Syria and I'm just going to let you know what I find. They're like, yeah, we'd be interested. Or are they actually saying, hey, here's some specific topics or pieces we'd like you to look into while you're over there?
At that time, it was, I had to bring the ideas to them, and it was also a really interesting time because you can't just go there for a week and write one article unless you're writing for like a big magazine, because you're not going to get anything. You're not going to make any of your money back. You have to find each thing that's a story to do 4 or 5 articles of the same thing. So maybe you find one interesting person, you can write a profile of that. Maybe you find an interesting phenomenon, like, there were a bunch of Christians in the neighborhood. So I wrote about what they were going through and what their fears were with everything happening. Then I did one overarching picture of the conflict itself and sort of that. So you gotta learn how to differentiate these different topics and sort of do it for different publications. You got to juggle a lot and find out a way to turn 1 week into like 5 or 6 different things.
And was it a 1 week trip this time?
So this time I was in Turkey for 2 weeks, and that I went ahead of time. I knew there was a ceasefire or truce being declared between Turkey has a war in the southeast against the Kurdish population there and the Kurdish group. So they were going to have this big ceasefire declaration. And, you knew that a month or two in advance. So that was one big story that I had going. So I went there, and then the same photographer I'd worked with before, we were going to go into Syria again together. We knew of a city that had this sort of all these different interesting things going on there. It was different groups. There was a vacuum of power there, and it was sort of like a foreshadowing of what the conflict could become. So we knew we were going there. So I think it was maybe 2 weeks in Turkey and then another week in Syria and then another week back in Turkey.
And how was Syria the second time?
The second time, each time I went somewhere, I would go somewhere more risky. And this time was a lot riskier because there was competing factions in that
It was like
area.
a proxy war between like Russia and the US, basically, right?
This is before that.
Oh, before it. Okay.
Yeah. So this was like, there was a Kurdish group there and they were fighting a Syrian non-Kurdish group. At that point, the Free Syrian Army, and then they were fighting the YPG, which is the Kurdish group, but they had sort of came up with a truce in this town at that point because the Assad regime had been forced out of that area. So, you had these sort of uneasy truce going on with these groups that were eventually going to fight each other. And then you had the emergence of the much more radical Syrian groups. So the Free Syrian Army was a sort of hodgepodge of different people with different ideas. There were some Islamist people in there, but there were also secular people in there that wanted a sort of, pluralist democracy to some degree. And then you had this emergence then of like the more radicalized groups. So there's a group there, it was called Jabhat al-Nusra, that were also there, and no one really knew what to make of them. About, I think, 2 days after we left, they sort of were declared as a Syrian affiliate of Al-Qaeda. So they were in the city as well. So it was a lot, it wasn't a hyperactive conflict zone at that point. There wasn't like trenches. There wasn't nightly shooting. But it was a very tense situation.
Yeah, I was going to say very tense, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. And so what, like you wake up in the morning and you just start knocking on doors, or do you go through an interpreter who already has some pre-set up interviews for you?
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of like that. Like we had a guy that we were working with who was from that town, who spoke fluent English and had a lot of connections. He was a young kid too. I think he must have been in his mid-20s. So yeah, I mean, we would wake up and he'd be like, what do you guys want to do? He had some story ideas. We had some story ideas. One day we'd be like, hey, we want to go to like talk to the Christians in the town. Or one day, he was affiliated with the FSA group. So we spent a lot of time just hanging out with them. It was kind of like the downtime of war. And some days we'd go on like runs with them where they would go like procure food. They'd go talk to a different group. One day he was like, do you want to talk to the Kurdish group? I have cousins there. I'm not allowed to go there, but I can sort of drop you off with them and you can get that element of the story, which was interesting because he was against them and he still was willing to do that for us. So yeah, it was a weird week, man. We basically lived with this rebel group of kids, people in their early to mid 20s who, were students or, they weren't, one or two of them had been a soldier before, but they were all living in a big house. They had sort of taken over and trying to figure out what to do next. And felt like being back in college.
I was going to say, how do you sleep out there? And probably not very well, right?
Yeah, I mean, we were
sleeping on the ground.
We were crashing. No, their houses. We were crashing at our guy's house. He still lived there. His dad was still there, so we stayed at his house. 1 or 2 nights we stayed with those guys. They were living in like a bigger house, not a villa per se, but like a bigger house. And we're staying with them and staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning, like, doing what young men do. So smoking cigarettes all night, sometimes a little bit of weed. Talking nonsense to each other, busting balls, stuff like that. It was a really, really weird experience, but like a really kind of formative one.
And when you came back, you had kind of alluded to having maybe a broader network or more contacts to sell your stories. How'd that go?
It went a lot better. So I had that one editor I had done that story for at NBC, and I had hit him up ahead of time, and he wanted the story on the truce in Turkey. So right away I had that story done. I had another story for him about the stuff in Syria. I had done a story for Vice at the time. Beforehand, that was the second story I sold from Iraq. They wanted a story. So I had options and I had proof that I could do this. So when you email someone and you're blind pitching at that point, you're telling them the story you had, but you're also showing them like, here are some links to stories I've done for reputable organizations and reputable places. It makes it a lot easier. So I was able to do 4 or 5 stories. Previously, I had done 2 stories the last trip. And everything like that is a stepping stone. You're building and you're building and you're building.
Kind of like building a resume book almost, but like.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly what it is.
And so did that lead to full-time employment at Vice, or was that something that came about separate?
No. I mean, I did a big story for Esquire for their online stuff at that point about the kids that I was with and what their lives were like. That was, I think, different from what a lot of people had done. And, it was like 4,000 or 5,000 words. And it was about the idea of like being with these young guys and what their lives were like. It wasn't about the war, really. It was about them as human beings. That got me a lot of attention. I went right back to work for the Wall Street Journal because that was like my steady gig. And I eventually got a fellowship. Yeah, like a grant, basically, to go do a story I wanted to do in Burma from the International Center for Journalists, which is a very reputable organization. You know, at that point, I made some money because I got my whole travel covered for, came back, a bunch more stories. And at that point, I had a bit of a name for myself. And then I had, so the Vice thing worked out because I had gone to a screening that they were doing when they were just starting to do like video and travel stuff. And, you know, I approached the guy who had made it and was like, hey, I'm a reporter. I've done this and that. I really like what you guys are doing. I want to do the same. I write right now. I've been doing this or whatever. Couple weeks later, he invited me to go meet him at the office. You know, we had lunch. He showed me around. And that had to have been in the first half of like 2013, I want to say. By the fall of that year, by the summer, they were planning to launch their news organization or their news element or vertical, whatever you want to call it. And he reached out to me after the Burma trip and he was like, look, I see what you're doing. Like, would you want to come aboard and work for us? So it was a bit of like having the work to show for it and also just having, cold approach this guy. I mean, like, hey, like I want to do that.
And so what was your first big deployment? It's not a military term, but like what was your first big assignment, at Vice?
So I did a couple of small things for them in New York where they were like, we want to do stuff about like New York at night. So I put together two things and I had never
I got you.
Yeah. I had never done video before.
Okay.
Like on camera video. And that was my first, they were like, yeah, just do. I mean, back then it was a great place to work because it was so kind of wild and out of the box thinking that like no one at,
that was what they were known for.
Yeah. And no one, I had a lot less tattoos then, but no one was going to put me on NBC News or ABC or any of those places back then. I didn't have the right look. I didn't act the same way.
What is Anderson Cooper? Is he a Vanderbilt?
Yeah. I didn't have the right family connections. Like I just didn't have the credentials or the look or the way of doing things. But Vice was like, yeah, just go for it. If you can do it, we'll give you a shot. If you can do it, you get to keep doing it. So I did those two things from New York. And there was this story that I was obsessed with at the time, which I had been planning to do before Vice, which was this country in the middle of Africa called the Central African Republic, one of the poorest countries in the world, was in the midst of this civil war that no one was talking about. In a couple places, I found out about it because there was a New York Times article about it. So people always say, no one's talking about this. Usually there are, but not a lot of people are. And I had read this article about this guy who was the leader who had taken over. I forget exactly. And he was on this like parade through the town waving at people and just no one was like waving back. And the place felt like it was going to explode. So I was really focused on getting there. And I got hired by Vice, I think in September, mid-September, mid-October. And, the place was figuring itself out. It was a really small organization then. No one really knew what was going on or what to do. But I kept pitching it. I was like, we have to go do this. We have to go do this. We have to go do this. Then eventually the guy who took me on, who ended up being the guy who headed Vice News, was like, okay, you want to go do this? Let's go do it. Put it together. And I did. And I remember getting really mad at one point because I was used to doing everything myself. And I didn't like trusting other people to do it. But they had like an associate producer.
I'm going to say they had infrastructure,
Barely.
Okay.
Barely at that point.
Who was funding Vice at the time?
I don't even know where they had their investments at that point.
But all right, so you actually had help now at Vice.
Sort of. And the help kind of screwed me because, you've got to get a visa to go there. And the person I trusted to get my visa, the AP, was like, oh, it'll be fine. We'll just mail it and it'll get done. Didn't get done. So the war kicks off there. Like they try to take the capital the day I was a couple days before I was supposed to have gotten there, but I had to delay because my visa wasn't ready. So I had to go down to DC on the train to their consulate, get my visa and come back. And I ended up going to the Central African Republic, just me and a cameraman. I had like $25,000 worth of cash on me at that point. We're landing.
That probably goes a long way down there, though.
Yeah,
$1 strong.
The hotels get expensive.
Yeah,
because the only hotels that stay open are there's like one fancy hotel that Gaddafi built that had a pool and like a breakfast buffet that cost $50, and you had to get it. But before I even got there, the capital gets overrun, And I'm like so mad, but we get it. And I'm going with this photographer who's very experienced, but also like a complete lunatic stereotype of what a war photographer is. Like I'm talking like done. Amazing guy, amazing photographer, but complete lunatic. Like the kind of guy who is smoking a joint in the car on the way when you're going to like the place where there's a shootout.
Yeah.
You know, like a TV version of a
No fear though.
Right. But before we get there, you know, we fly from New York to France to Morocco, and then you're supposed to fly to Cameroon and then Central African Republic. The airport shuts down because it's become a refugee camp. So we land in Cameroon and I have no way of getting there.
And you feel like, man, we missed it.
Right. I'm so mad at that point. I'm so frustrated. And I'm like, we got to find a way to get there. And I found out we're in Cameroon for 3 days. I find out that, you know, the UN are still going in there. I forget if it was the UN or the NGOs that were going in there, taking tiny planes. And it took me like a day or two of contacting everyone I know, but we're able to get on that flight. And, you know, you feel good. You're like, all right, I know how to problem solve. I know how to do this. And then we land there. And yeah, and then it was like 2 weeks of running around with this guy in this, I mean, you know, it's a developing world city that's like one of the poorest countries in the world. So you can imagine there's no apartment buildings there. You know, it's a lot of dirt roads. We end up staying in this insane hotel that Gaddafi built. That's like a, you know, 5-star hotel with this breakfast buffet for $50. I'm sneaking out like plates of food to give to my, what they call a fixer, the guy who helps you out there. Oh, that's another thing. Our fixer, who was supposed to be the super fixer, couldn't make it across the border from the country next door. I think the Democratic Republic of Congo, because it had gotten shut down. So we've got to get a new fixer right away. And we ended up making what I think is an incredible documentary. But, you know, it was just like, it's wild.
What was the kind of craziest thing you saw while there?
So, you know, we're showing up on scenes. The French military's there. You know, we're doing this report on how they're there and no one knows what's going on. Guy comes up to us with a guy in a wheelbarrow. He's bleeding out from his leg because he had been like hit with a machete. You know, we're just like driving down roads and you're following troops and like, you know, you're hearing RPGs go off. And I wasn't super experienced then. You know, the last night we're there, we go to a briefing with Samantha Power, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time. And we go to this press briefing because they're there talking about like what needs to be done or whatever else. And on the way back, we hear that there's like some like firefight breaking out or some attack. So we go follow it. And as we're following these like trucks that are going there, one of them turns around and it's coming back for us. And we hear, you know, it firing going off and we just kind of panicked. Ran out of the car, ran into like a village. There's gunfire. This is all on video. Like it's in the last part of the documentary. There's gunfire going on all around us. It's like getting dark. We're stuck in this village. We don't know which way to go. Yeah. We keep happening on people that are like bleeding out. At one point we get into a truck. Our truck actually shows up. The driver was much more calm and collected than I was. So he shows up. We put this guy who's like bleeding out in the back of the truck, but we don't know where we can go or what we can do. Eventually we end up following some people to a church compound. We have to get rescued by the French military that was there. But yeah, I mean, we were just like in the dark, like following these guys.
Were there moments, you know, whether it's gunfire or seeing people who have been hit and, you know, possibly won't make it, where you're like, what am I doing here? Like this isn't worth it.
Yes and no. I mean, at points when you have the adrenaline going and like things are, it sounds really horrific to say, but when things are going right, when you're seeing this stuff happening, when you're getting this footage, you feel like I feel like I have a purpose. I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. The moments when things are going wrong, in the sense that like, you know, maybe you've been trying for days to get permission to go somewhere and you keep getting turned down. Maybe all these amazing things and interviews you had set up and embeds you had set up are failing.
Yeah.
That's when you're like, you have those mornings where you're like I could have just gone to law school. Like, what am I doing with my life? I'm the worst person in the world at this. By the afternoon, you could get something amazing and you're like, I'm incredible. I'm the best person to ever have done this before. But it's maybe I'm sure there's other people that are more even keeled, but it's, you know, there's definitely days when you're like, this is stupid.
What do you wear? What are you wearing? You're wearing a combat helmet. You're wearing a vest that says, does it say reporter? Does it say media? Like, how do you distinguish yourself from a combatant?
Yeah. You know, you have I mean, in the Central African Republic, it's a little easier. I don't really look like the average combatant there.
Not so much.
But yeah, you know, in a lot of situations, you have your helmet and your vest that says press.
Press. That's right.
Yeah.
And is that, you know, because you see these, you've seen these terrible videos, more so in the Middle East, of like, you know, beheadings or whatever. And I don't know if those were press per se. Those might have been more contractors, like defense contractors. But do all the sides respect that?
No, definitely not.
Right?
I mean, you know, James Foley, who was, I think it was the anniversary.
Yeah, that's what I said.
10 years ago, a couple days ago. So he, you know, was press. And that's the, you know, when you were in Syria or Iraq, groups like ISIS or whatever, you were actually more of a target.
Yeah.
So sometimes you would not want to wear
American.
You want to take that press badge and not. Yeah. I mean, I'm a Jewish American from New York working for the media there. I'm like,
you're a mark.
You get me, you kidnap me, like you're getting a raise.
You're worth a lot of money.
That's a for them. No, they don't even want the money. Like, that's my head on like a, you know, but yeah, so you have to be wary of that. You know, there's debate sometimes. You're like, do you want to be identified as press when you're going somewhere, or do you not? In a lot of places in the world, you know, El Salvador, even the Central African Republic, nobody wants a dead American journalist on their hands
because it brings heat on them.
That's a headache. You know, when you're trying to do your war crimes and do whatever else, that's a headache for anyone.
Yeah.
ISIS, again, like jihadi groups, they have
a different motivation.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Understood. Yeah, because I always thought about that. I was like, man, these guys are calling themselves press, so clearly they're not combatants of the local tribes or the local armies or the local factions. Like, if any of those sides or all of them, they're just like, well, why don't we go? Well, why don't we take this person, or why don't we, you know, do something there? It's like, whether it's a ransom or from an ideology perspective, they actually want to cause harm. I always wondered how that worked, and so I guess a case by case basis, right?
Yeah, and you also have to be smart. You know, sometimes you're going into like an area where there's, you know, it's a hot zone. You know, if you get out and you're throwing up a tripod, what does that look like sometimes? Doesn't look like a camera.
No.
If you're facing like, you know, 19-year-old kids who are, you know, we had this in Ukraine and all, like you're facing 19-year-old kids who, you know, are jumpy in the first place.
They're jumpy. They're scared out of their mind. You know, they're probably high, drunk, whatever.
Yeah, CAR, definitely.
Yeah.
Like, you know, Syria too. Like, you know, you don't want them to think you're something you're not sometimes. Sometimes you do. I don't know. It's a case by case basis with everything.
All right. So you pitch Vice on this big, like, we got to go to this place. We got to go to the Central African Republic. We got to go there. There's this conflict. Like, we need to be there. They say, okay, couple problems, but you figured it out. You got there. You got the footage. How did it go? Like, was it what you thought it would be?
Yeah. I mean, it was great. Honestly, like, I had to depend a lot. Editors are such a big part of documentary making. And at that point, I was so green that I was a lot more dependent on them than I should have been. So I worked with some great editors. We put this thing together. It took months, right? Because you also have to get translations. You gotta go through like 20 hours of footage, all that sort of stuff. And it came out like right when we were launching Vice News, and people were it did well. People were happy with it. Even, you know, reporters who I really respected, like guys, John Lee Anderson is like one of the people I admire the most. You know, long form writer for the New Yorker, was talking about how like Vice was some of the only people that covered the Central African Republic. And you know, I was on a high for like years, because once I could prove that I could do it, the next opportunity, and my stuff was doing well. So it's kind of just like, you know, you're running around the world making these amazing.
I know you ended up going back to Syria, but I want to skip to El Salvador and MS-13, because that actually is something that is relevant here, you know, because it appears that gang has some presence in the United States. I don't know to what degree and how much is like just political talk, but how much is real. But how did that come about?
Yeah, that they do. I think they've been kind of cracked down on. They were present in like Long Island, DC, California, but they you know, they got cracked down pretty hard. So I think now the new gang that they're talking about is Tren de Agua, I think, or Tren de Agua. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. It's a Venezuelan gang. So that's sort of like the new scary gang that's showing up here. But, you know, El Salvador in 2015 was having, I mean, they had a high murder rate for a decade, but 2015 was reaching like unparalleled levels. So I had started talking to them about pitching this story. That point, they actually brought in another producer to work on it with me who had spent some time there before. So, again, sales, you got to sell the story. Why is this important? Why are people going to want to watch this? The thing about El Salvador is that everyone is interested in watching a story when there's guys with face tattoos. That just gang members with face tattoos, sales every time.
Yeah.
I mean, my pitch had to be a lot more well-formed than that. The record murder rate really
How close did you come to getting a face tattoo?
I try to keep it.
You got to fit in. Come on.
My mom is disappointed enough already, so
Yeah.
I got to keep it with long sleeve shirts.
It's a good decision you did.
Hide everything.
Again, if you're gonna formally join MS-13, then yes, maybe a face tattoo is needed. But so you pitch them on this idea, and they send you down.
Yeah, I mean, there were stories that I got told no to. I'm making it seem like, oh, I have this great idea and everything. Like,
Yeah, sure.
Green light.
No,
You have to. It's like we keep mentioning sales. I have to win over my boss. I've got to convince him that it's worth, weeks of my time, weeks of our time. People are going to watch it, that it's going to do well, and that it's worth the financial investment to tell this story, and that I want to be able to deliver on the story.
Walk the audience through the economics of journalism. Like, so just in rough numbers here, when you're pitching this idea of going down to El Salvador and MS-13 and kind of embedding yourself or just, learning more about them, how much in summary would that cost Vice in this case?
So if you're doing it in-house, right, where you're not hiring a producer, on-camera person, or an editor, which we did, you still have to have those 3 people's salaries for probably 2 months, because that's what it takes to put something like that together. We made an hour-long documentary. You've got insurance, which depending on where you're going, if you're going to Iraq or Syria, it's very expensive, right? You've got the camera equipment, again, in-house, but you're using, camera setups that cost $40,000, $50,000 sometimes, and you want 2 of them. You've got to pay for the plane tickets, for 2 weeks of housing, 2 weeks of food. Again, El Salvador, cheaper. Fixers, sometimes security. We didn't really work with security back then, but car rentals.
You gotta have a lot of cash.
Right. Translators for when you come back for the editors, you have to hire them. So we're talking like, not including employee salaries. We did things a lot cheaper. The HBO show, which I did 1 or 2 things for, they had budgets. They could go up to like $450,000, $500,000 for a 15-minute piece. $50,000 probably, I think, for El Salvador, not including employee salaries.
And so then how do they factor in an ROI? Is it clicks? Is it downloads? Is it screen? Like, is it ads on the right side of the web page? Like, how did this is so foreign to me. This part.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, advice, the ROI,
they have no idea.
It was more like cred and and all that. But a big part of where they made money was their branding stuff for advertising. So we would get them the cred. Like, this is a cool company that people watch that does awesome things. And then you use that to sell yourself to an advertising company, Intel, right? Branded content, things like that. You're not going to make enough money off YouTube ads and things like that. And clicks, subscribers, all that. Everything about then was about building up the brand. You were losing money on all these productions, but the hope was that you would make it up in, content deals or in lower advertisers.
I think I get that. It's not a direct correlation.
No.
I mean, certainly they probably track downloads and clicks and all that.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, if Vice can put out 50 of these really badass documentaries a year and it just levels up their credibility in the journalism world, they could get kind of bigger macro sponsors, which will like bring in chunky revenue for the company.
Yeah.
Like, they should tie together.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. And so what was El Salvador like?
El Salvador was, I mean, it's weird because you go to these places, like I'm going to these places looking for the worst things possible. And back then El Salvador was like a dicey area. In a lot of neighborhoods, you had to have gang permission to go in. It's a Central American country. It wasn't doing great at the time. There's beautiful beaches there. They had like, backpacker spots with surfers and things like that. But the gang presence in 2015 was so powerful that like, you had to know what neighborhood you were going into, who was in charge of it. Did you have permission to go there? You could probably avoid these things if you were going there. If you're a foreigner going there to do business in some of the nicer neighborhoods. but you'd be aware of it because you'd see security everywhere. You'd see guys with shotguns outside ATMs and outside stores everywhere. So it was, I felt I love the country. I think it's doing much, much better now.
Yeah, because I think they got a pretty hardline ruler in place who cracked
Bukele
down like crazy.
Doesn't mess around.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting discussion.
Amazing
right?
how
because,
that law and order thing works, right?
Yeah. And
I think that's how they are tying it back is like, if there's actual like established punishment for crime, like they were talking about how the crime had gone down so much that now it's like the safest country and business, but tourism was like blowing up there.
It's doing what? Look, there's a trade-off there, right? Like he's getting accused. Well, a lot of NGOs, a lot of international organizations have talked about the crackdown on rights, right? Because some of these people might, they're not getting fair trials.
There's no due
process,
right? There
is
isn't the due process that we believe that we hope you are proud of here.
But you talk to people in El Salvador, and it's kind of like I had this experience there. They're thrilled. Not all of them, right? There's some newspaper journalists that have kicked out, but they're thrilled. They're like, thank God someone did this. And, I had this realization there that like, it's very easy for me to go there and be like, well, how can you support his crackdown? How can you be in favor of like these people not having rights? I didn't have to live under that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to no gang member killed my brother or, raped my sister or anything like that. And that was an experience that a lot of people in El Salvador had. So they were just completely fed up with it. So he has like an extremely high approval rating. And again, crackdown on rights for sure. Like that's proven vicious, but like at some point you do have to give him credit for what he's been able to accomplish.
Yeah, it's the scales of justice. It's like, some people probably certainly didn't have the due process they were owed. And then the greater society is benefiting from more, let's call it law and order, but complicated. When you were down there, was there any crazy moments? I mean, I'm going to ask you a couple questions here. Like any crazy moments, where you're like, man, I think this might not work out well for me. And my next question is kind of like, how do you begin building relationships with those gangs? And I don't want to say assimilate, but like get them comfortable to tell you their story.
Yeah. Not on that first trip. On a second trip, I went down there to do a documentary on people who were leaving the gangs through the evangelical church, which is like one of the only ways you can get out. And I was with a guy American guy, but lived down there during the time, spent a lot of time there. And we were in a MS-13 neighborhood. And look, again, nobody wants to, it's happened down there before, I think with the European journalists, but nobody wants 2 dead American journalists on their hands. That's a bad look, but that doesn't mean they're not going to threaten you. So we were just walking around a neighborhood and we had permission to be there, but we were filming. We were with a pastor who was like who had been a gang member. It was,
So we had like the respect of
right.
Yeah.
But still, 2 little kids came up to us at one point and they were like, they said something in Spanish I didn't understand, but they were basically saying those guys over there said that you have to leave now. And if you don't leave, there's going to be problems.
Hmm.
And again, like, it's not a fun situation to be in. I wasn't super concerned because, we were going to do what they told us to do. And yeah, but, there's moments like that here and there. Sometimes you're kind of like, oh, this is going to be a great story to tell when I get back from the trip. It's dicey, but it wasn't, I didn't feel completely like my life was being threatened. And the trust thing is, it's an interesting question. A lot of the times you're really focused on, or you really owe a lot of it to your fixer, the local down there that you're working with. But you also have to go in and your demeanor has to be something that they're going to respond to. So that means for me, like I like to just go in there acting like I belong, like not being rude, but like being a smiling, grinning idiot. So I walk in there, I get introduced to people. I'm going to walk up, I'm going to shake your hand, being like a doofus so that you just don't think twice about like telling me something or hanging out with me. That's my strategy.
You're like affable, but also like harmless.
Right. Sometimes they want you to show that like you can tell some people want you to be scared of them. So you deferential in that way. I mean, other people I think don't do that route. They have their own methods. Methods always worked for me. I think it's made, I think it comes across to people sometimes as endearing and it's more, it goes along with my personality better.
We touched on something just a second ago, judgment and judging people. Like an NGO goes down to El Salvador, is like, how are you, taking these people's rights and due process and like kind of judging the government? And then just from a third party, you could judge people, be like, oh, these gang members, these monsters, these animals down there who do this, that, and the other. And the same can be applied to, the country in Africa, Central Republic of Africa.
Central African Republic.
God, I keep getting Central African Central African Republic.
Car. Yeah.
Central African Republic. You probably could, we all could think the same of either or both sides in Syria or Iraq or, anywhere. It's always that powerful P word. How have these trips given you perspective in terms of like judging people and the actions that they have? Where like, from the US, we live in our ivory tower. We're like, these people, like, how could they do these terrible, like what places of the world were you kind of struck from like I judged these people before I got here. And now again, I'd like to think I wouldn't do these things, but at least I understand more why they're compelled to do things that from afar look savage or brutal or something that I could never see myself doing. But I've never been in their shoes. Like,
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously there's still hard lines, right? But I think El Salvador was a big perspective shift in that way, because when Bukele started winning elections with like 90% of the country, you're kind of like, well, what do they see that I don't? And then you kind of realize they have to live this. I'm an interloper. I go somewhere for 2 weeks, for a month, for 6 weeks, for 2 months. And then I get to go home, and my family's not under threat. My favorite restaurant, I can come back and have a cheeseburger within 24 hours of being in most war zones in my favorite restaurant, Ukraine was kind of, I was in Ukraine in 2022. That was sort of a big, not perspective shift, but a big sort of awakening for me in something that I didn't realize, right? Because, I remember, I think Mitt Romney said it, like Russia was this big threat and all that. And we were like, yeah, sure, whatever. And maybe that was 2012.
Well, it was in the debates. It was Romney versus Obama.
Yeah.
And Romney was asked the question, I'm going to paraphrase, like, what's the biggest threat to the United States? And he said, Russia, and Obama sarcastically was like, hey, the Cold War wants its foreign policy back, and everybody laughed at him.
Yeah. And I don't know if the biggest threat to America, but it's definitely a big threat. And I didn't realize, I thought the Cold War was long over. I didn't think Russia was capable of launching these attacks in Europe. But you spent 6 weeks in Ukraine and you talk to Poles and Estonians and Latvians, Ukrainians, Georgians, all that. And they're like, no, we knew this was coming. And not only that, like the Poles, the Ukrainians, Lithuanians, all that, they've been like, no, we knew they were going to come here. And we've been waiting for this and we've been training for it for years. And they were way more right than I was. They were cautious of it because the Soviet Russia, whatever you want to call it, a lot of them have lived through that. They know what it's like, and they know what is actually, in their media, the way they cover these things, they were aware of what the goals were there. So, it sounded silly for anyone to say that in the US, I think, even 2021, even when they had already invaded Ukraine.
And this was after the war had started in the spring. Was it
2022?
February 22.
Yeah, I was there in April and May of 2022.
Kiev
or March.
In the capital.
I was in the capital. I was in the east, Donbas region. I was in like Kharkiv in the north.
And was there active fighting around you?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Back then,
how was that?
Yeah, I mean, it was like
because I'm thinking like, okay, you spent time in Central African Republic, which again, I'm not sure. You correct me if I'm wrong. Is it kind of more like a tribal conflict, like small arms, like I think you said machetes? Spent time in El Salvador, gang violence, again, like kind of almost turf. Ukraine, Russia is like a conventional war.
Right, exactly. It was like it was trench warfare.
Yeah.
There were planes, drones were huge.
Yeah, there is no conventional war, but like a conventional war with like tanks.
No, you're right, tanks and all that. No,
but then drones, certainly.
That was exactly what it was, and it was, that's a lot to deal with. Like it was, And you heard these stories of like, some Westerners that had fought in Iraq and Afghanistan going there and being like kind of shocked at how brutal it was, because it is like,
and I think it's only gotten worse.
oh yeah.
Like it's really,
it's like World War II type stuff, the stuff that I'd only seen in movies. I'd been, in Humvees before, and technicals are huge in the Middle East. And obviously Assad had an air force. But yeah, it was something. And like, you feel the ground shake, and you're in these places with the mortars coming and all that. And it was dire for sure.
What have you learned? This podcast, we spend so much time, or we try to like really on the mentality of human beings. Most of the time, every time it's the person sitting in the chair, and we've kind of touched on it with you, but actually I want, if you can tell us what you saw and like the mentality of these, humans on 3 different continents in very difficult situation, like just where every day, there seems to be a very real possibility that like tomorrow is not guaranteed. Certainly not in Ukraine or Russia or Africa or even El Salvador. Like what gets these people through their days and their existence? Like, and I know it's a very loaded question. You have to generalize here, but like, what have you seen in, I guess, human nature that like keeps these people going?
I think people are resilient for sure, like a lot more resilient than we give them credit for. Like, it's kind of, I guess, is the boiling frog the right metaphor?
Yeah.
But like, people can adapt.
Yeah,
they can adapt. It's not.
If you dropped an American in one of those, like they would be overwhelmed and freak out. But like for them, it's just like, I guess every day it's just the heat's turned up.
I go back and forth with a lot of stuff about human nature and stuff like that. Like I definitely, you're in these war zones, you see the best of people and you see the worst. I also think that like most people just want to like, have dinner with their family and not worry about anything, and just like have a house and have land and do that sort of stuff. But I also know that like, I forget what it's called. There's a book about the former Yugoslavia, like the wars there in the 90s. And there's this quote they use from another book, and it talks about how, when the bonds of civilization that we think are so strong, when they break, people can, like, we think we're all great here, but like something could break out here, go right back to like tribalism.
Yeah.
To
there's a very thin line between like civilized society and anarchy.
We really hope, like, we think we're past it in a lot of ways, but
you've seen that as a species, we're not.
Right. And it's kind of like when you have people who talk about like wanting the revolution in America and over, let me tell you something, when that comes, like, you're not going to want to, if it comes, hopefully it won't. You don't want to be here for it.
No, not based on what you've seen. Yeah.
No, not at all.
I'm sure overwhelmingly you've met good people on your journeys, but have you met some, again, I was talking about not judging people, but like you talked about, there are clear lines for you who live on the other side of your clear line, like that are just bad dudes. Have you met some really bad people out there?
I mean, back in CIR, you're meeting warlords and, Salvador gangsters. Every place I've been to, there's Syria. Like what some of those people got up to afterwards or before.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, there are some people who like right away you have a bad feeling about them, but at other times, like, normal people can be pushed to do pretty heinous things.
Well, where I was going with that is, and I don't have the experience you do, but I at least like I tell myself that, well, the people who do these bad things in other places, like a lot of it is driven by, again, like they're really just trying to like protect their family or put food on the plate, or if they don't, they'll be killed. Like, it's like they're basically forced to commit atrocities or whatever. And so even if someone does something bad by our context, at least in our society, it's not because they're bad people. It's their circumstances, but there are some sociopaths out there.
Oh, for sure.
And so the question I wanted to ask was like, you don't have to name names, but like, was there a person who stood out where you met him or you got to know him in, weeks or months in a country where like, this is a total sociopath. This is a psycho. This is a bad dude. And like, it's just like evil, like, just a darkness in someone.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure I have, and I'm sure that there are people that, I'm trying to think. Oh, I mean, I had to go. I actually went to The Hague for one of the guys I met in CAR who was like a warlord there. But I don't like, you meet a guy and he's wearing camouflage in a war zone with like the, very old school African warlord type. And you're like, all right, this guy probably isn't a good dude. And it apparently turned out to be true. Yeah, I don't know. And you also meet people like when they're old men. When they're old men that did a lot of heinous stuff when they were younger. But you meet them 40 years later and you're like, oh, this is just like I just spent some time doing some mafia stuff in the Midwest. Again, these guys weren't evil, but like they were probably pretty scary 30 years ago. Now,
like just a
now I can interview them and I can push them as much as I want because what are they going to do to me now? They're 75 years old.
Yeah.
But 30 years ago, I probably would have kept my mouth shut a lot more.
Yeah, they've kind of evolved as people, perhaps.
I don't know if they've evolved as people, but like they're, feeble. Push them
I got
downstairs.
you. They're literally like super old. I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So look, again, Africa, Central America, Middle East, Ukraine. What's the next trip for you? I know you're thinking of something.
Yeah, I mean, honestly,
you're probably thinking of something dangerous and stupid.
No, my priorities have shifted a bit. I know that's disappointing, but like,
you're getting old. See,
no, I want to take a trip to the bank. I need to find somewhere to get to be able to buy a house. It's a young man's job. It's an inherently selfish job. I think it's hard. I don't have a wife or a family, and it's hard to make that happen.
That would be tough. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, I'm out for 6 weeks, and oh, by the way, like I'm going somewhere pretty scary.
Right. It's an inherently selfish. People do it and have families, and it seems to work out. Same thing with financial stuff. I love doing the job. I love doing the work. If there was a way for me to keep doing it and make like, buying a house in the suburbs of New York money, I would keep doing it. And there are people that can. Anderson Cooper, very well for himself. Like he needed it. Other people, but it's a very small percentage of people still doing this job that make good money. I mean, I have a friend who, one of the premier photojournalists I would say in the world. Like he shoots the cover story for New York Times Magazine. He shoots photos for the New Yorker, all that. I would bet everything I have that he makes less money than a third-tier dentist in suburban New Jersey. And this is the cover of the New York Times Magazine. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do. And I guess in a way that's it's a bummer. It's sad to hear because it just, I guess, I don't know, it's like the market's the market. But I kind of was thinking as you were talking is like the idealism in journalism, just of all the industries, I feel like people who go into journalism are like, from a traditional definition, the most idealistic people. Like I'm gonna go change the world. I'm gonna go to difficult places and like shine a light on corruption or people who are being wrong, and I'm gonna help go fix, and establish justice in the world or in my communities or whatever. And then with a lot of the changes in the industry, that runs dead on smack into a wall called reality, financial reality. Of like, you have to pay your bills. You have to, like, where are you going to buy a house? Like, how are you going to raise a family? And, touch on how that is impacting this industry and your industry and how that's like kind of impacting the mindsets of so many journalists like yourself, where you're like, look, I love what I do, but I like, there's a reality that I can't like pay my bills based on passion,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things too. You also get a lot more cynical, I think, as the idealism goes away pretty quickly. But
why is that? Because like, it goes away towards like humanity because you see so many, or it goes away because you realize the business is kind of corrupt in some sense.
I don't know if it's corrupt, but the business isn't.
It isn't always a meritocracy,
right? And you see how the sausage is made, and you also realize that like you could do the most incredible story in the world. It's a good chance it's not going to make a difference. Very good chance. So it doesn't always matter. Like there are stories that make a difference. People go down for corruption, but there's also people that like
you could pitch your editor this incredible story that actually would do good in the world. Or a story about like writing some clickbait about the lolocal politician. He's like, well, that one's going to get more clicks. So let's do that. And you're like, but wait. Like,
that too.
Yeah.
But also like I look at, one of the biggest, we're talking like 2005, like one of the biggest pieces of real estate and journalism ever, New York Times op-ed page, right? For years, Nick Kristof was writing about Darfur in the 2000s. Didn't make a difference. did not make a difference. The biggest audience out there, the most prestigious place to do it. You're writing these articles about this like horrific war and tragedy and genocide going on. No difference. And then also, you see how the sausage gets made in the industry itself, and you kind of lose faith in it, I think, a bit. But the financial thing is a huge aspect of it, because especially now, like there's just it's very hard to make money for any outlet doing it. All the magazines are basically gone. Newspapers are like, a couple of them are hanging on for dear life. And there's
what impact or effect you like social media or like X, Twitter, obviously with Elon Musk acquisition, where it's like, hey, citizen journalism, like, and possibly even you considering like, hey, why don't I just do these myself and just build a following that way?
I mean, some people do that. I think
it's just hard to monetize.
It's hard to monetize. The people that do make a good living off it, I think, are incredibly partisan. So they're either leaning hyper left or hyper right. And that's what
they're just talking to their echo chamber.
Right. Or very few of them actually do reporting. They're pundits, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah. Or operatives for their party.
Right. Yeah. They're not being honest about, I think, a lot of the work that they're doing. Everything is put through a prism of like how their echo chamber should view it. And again, I'm not saying this one side or the other. Both sides do this, and people do this.
And again, that's not that you're correct me if I'm wrong, you're kind of like a purist journalist. You're like, the truth is the truth, and so
I have my biases for sure, but I try to leave those out of the reporting that I was doing. Plus, I like to do on the ground stuff, and that again, hyper expensive to do that. You have these people on YouTube who go there with their like selfie stick or one camera guy, and they're doing these like, I guess they're more like, we're traveling to bad places. There's a little bit of merit to that. It's not journalism though.
Yeah. I saw a guy, and maybe this is what you're referring to, who went to Gaza. I think he did have a camera crew. He went to Gaza, like this was like a month ago, and he started interviewing him, but like asking him tough questions, like within 30 minutes, like he had to bail. Like
that too.
Yeah.
But also like, guys who are like, I went to the deadliest neighborhood or the biggest slum and whatever. And that stuff's, I don't watch that stuff. I understand why people do. It's interesting to a degree, but it's not journalism. It's not what I do.
So how do you see your career kind of evolving? Obviously, again, you've done a lot of these pretty hardcore trips.
Yeah.
What do you see yourself doing 10 years from now?
That's a great question. The problem too with media is that every 18 months or every 3 years, there's a new thing that's supposed to save it, or a new company that you start working for that ends up losing money. And like after 18 months, they got to shut down. So I've had to switch many times in my life. I started doing writing when I realized that writing was falling by the wayside. And if you wanted to like get investments and resources, you did video. I did video. When video sort of started going down the tubes, I switched to doing podcasting. That's what I do right now. It's a lot easier. There's a lot less resources needed to do it. I don't know. I have a couple of podcasts that are more documentary style that are coming out. I'm actually pitching a TV show with a friend who's a comedy writer, like a fiction show. That's like a dark comedy about freelance war reporting. It's a good question. I honestly am not sure.
That's cool. Well, you have a lot of options, and we need more comedy. I feel like in the last 10 years, things aren't as funny as they used to be.
It's really ripe for a dark comedy, man. Like that genre. Yeah. It's so perfect.
Yeah, I think for a while there, everybody was afraid of offending people, but I feel like people are like, okay, let's have some humor,
I hope so. I mean, we've had some great meetings. It's just nothing's gotten off the ground yet, but we'll see.
I always ask the question of guests, something we can leave the audience with and, help them in personal, professional development. Doesn't have to even be related to journalism, but is there, a club, an organization, a book, something that, over the years, like you found like really made a difference for you?
Yeah. I really like there's a book called The Zanzibar Chest that really inspired me to go into journalism. It's by this guy, Aidan Hartley.
Is it a book about journalism?
It's like a memoir.
Okay.
But he talks about being a journalist there, and it kind of, some good pieces of advice. And it talks about, he was a correspondent, like a freelance reporter in East Africa in the 90s. And he covered like all these conflicts and wars and situations. And I don't know, it's something about it really made me want to become a journalist.
And what advice, because again, you've been in some sticky situations, and again, it doesn't have to be the exact same type, of course, but a lot of our audience and just everybody has these moments where they want to take, like they're afraid, they have fear, and their fear is paralyzing them from accomplishing what they want or getting to where they want to go, whether it's a promotion, whether it's starting a business. We have obviously a lot of the business community listens. Anything, you've been in these moments where there was fear, whether it was like raising your hand for the first time, say, I'll go over there. Or, that scene you kind of walked us through in Africa with bullets flying, all that. Like, what advice would you have for a listener in terms of developing a mentality that allows them, because I don't think you can control fear. Like, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward in light of the fear. What advice would you have that's helped you in terms of overcoming that fear and just going for it?
Tell people that you're close with that you're going to do something before you do it.
There you go.
That definitely helps. I would say I do this sometimes too. I have anxiety about normal things too. I'll try to imagine the worst possible thing that could happen if this incident happens, or this doesn't work in war journalism, but in other aspects of life.
Yeah.
And after a while, you're like, oh, that's not that bad. A lot of the times in life, the worst thing that could happen is someone saying no. My job too, worst thing that happens is somebody says no. So end of the day, it's not the end of the world.
I agree.
Well, unless you're asking someone to marry. Yeah, I mean, that could be tough.
But it's funny. No, you're right. I think for most situations, and I mean overwhelming, like it's really just they say no. And what it is people are afraid of, other than the no, is the shame of like the embarrassment or people finding out. And then if you really shine a light on that, like what does that mean? It's like, well, my family, if they really love me, my friends, if they really love me, they're my true friends, they're not going to care that I didn't get promoted or she said no or whatever it is. Like, and so I found in asking this question of people, because like, people reach out to me as well and they'll say, hey, like, I've been thinking about this. Why don't you do it? And they're like, well, I'm just afraid if it fails. Like, well, what is the fear? Is it like you're running out of money? No. Is it the actual like failure? No. It's like, well, just people knowing that I failed. I was like, oh.
I think, people respect shooters, right? That was the whole thing with this job. Like the fact that I went and did it. A lot of people talk about it, not as many of them actually go and do it. Even if you go do something and you don't do a good job of it, people respect the fact that you took a swing in the first place.
I love that analogy. I've never heard of people respect shooters. Like, I'm a big Kobe fan. Like Kobe actually didn't make a lot of his shots, but they loved him because he wasn't afraid to shoot.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
yeah, that's a good one.
I also like other stuff, like create some lore in your head. Like I used to do this when I was like, when I was really young and like you were scared to ask a woman out or something like that. Like, think about if someone says no to you for one of these things. I mean, this might not work in all situations, like job stuff, but you get to tell your friends afterwards and like, make a joke about it, and they'll respect the fact that you
do it in a job. Yeah, man. I finally built up the courage. I went in the boss and said, yeah, it's time to get a promoter raise. Said no, and you're like, go to the bar, laugh it off, right?
Bar stories, man.
They're the best. Danny, I can't thank you enough. Your stories are great, man. This is awesome, and congratulations on all your success. And you've done some hairy stuff, but hopefully we'll see more of it.
Yeah, that was fun, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, man.